And do you want to move on to the next slide? Great. Okay, you can probably take down the slides now. Hello and welcome everyone to our virtual side event in the lead up to the 37th session of the Human Rights Council's Working Group on the Universal Periodic Review. The next UPR session starts next Monday, the 18th of January, and we're going to cover death penalty issues today in several of the countries that are slated for review next week and the following week. This event is co-sponsored by the Advocates for Human Rights, Ensemble contre la peine de mort, the Association Mauritanienne des Droits de l'Homme, the Mauritanian Association of Human Rights, and Greater Caribbean for Life. And because we have representatives of Greater Caribbean for Life here, I'll let Leela Ramdeen talk a little bit about GCL, or Greater Caribbean for Life. Leela is also chair of the Catholic Commission for Social Justice and is on the board of Greater Caribbean for Life. So Leela, why don't you tell us a little bit about GCL, please?
Yes, okay, hello everyone. Okay, so the Greater Caribbean for Life was established in October 2013. It is an independent, not-for-profit civil society organization incorporated under the laws of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. We really have been spending our time trying to raise awareness of the need to abolish the death penalty and the reasons why we should be doing that. Although we condemn the rise of violent crime and express solidarity with victims, we continuously make it clear that we reject the notion that capital punishment will act as a deterrent or foster respect for life in our communities. So we promote in peace, respect for life, and good neighborliness as appropriate methods of reducing crime in our region. And of course, this strategy, we feel, is a more durable and effective solution than taking lives. So our aim, therefore, has been to stop crime and not lives. And we're engaged at the moment in partnership with 4 other organizations in trying to bring about the abolition in Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean state. It's a European Union funded project, and we seek the support of everyone in trying to bring about the abolition in our English-speaking Caribbean countries, and there are 10 of them, English-speaking Caribbean countries, and they all have the death penalty, and they all will not vote for the moratorium at the UN General Assembly. So we can talk further about that later.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction, Leela. And Greater Caribbean for Life, along with the Advocates for Human Rights and ECPM, are members of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, which is an umbrella organization that helps coordinate activities, including coordinating activities to provide information to delegates to the Human Rights Council, looking forward to the Universal Periodic Review Interactive Dialogue. So that's another function of this virtual side event, is to provide information to delegates who are planning their interventions for retentionist countries in the upcoming 2 weeks. So what we thought we would do is first, we're going to cover, as an overview, we'll cover St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, Mauritania, Myanmar, and Lebanon. And we'll have about 5-minute presentation for each country. And then we'll have discussion and have time for questions if there are questions from the audience. And what we'd like each speaker to address when they offer their 5 to 7-minute interventions is first give an overview of the status of the death penalty in the country, what the relevant issues and concerns are, and then to identify some priority recommendations that you would like to see states make during the interactive dialogues next week and the following week. And we, of course, always want recommendations to abolish the death penalty, to institute a de jure moratorium on executions, to ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But I think it would be more helpful in this discussion to suggest additional recommendations that you think delegates might not necessarily think of, but that would help advance progress toward abolition in the relevant countries. So I think it'll be helpful to hear what the different panelists think in that regard. So we will start with St. Kitts and Nevis, and we have live from St. Kitts, Angelina Soku Sukubab, and she is an attorney at law in St. Kitts and also active with Greater Caribbean for Life. So Angelina, I'll let you take it away and tell us more about death penalty and what suggested recommendations you'd have for delegates.
Thank you very much, Amy, and good day from sunny St. Kitts to all your listeners. Just to start off, St. Kitts and Nevis is one of the smallest Commonwealth countries. We are part of the Commonwealth Caribbean, and we have just over 50,000 residents and nationals between the Twin Island Republic, Federation, sorry. St. Kitts and Nevis has a Privy Council as its highest court, and we are run by a written constitution, which is a supreme law. Now, in that constitution, under the fundamental freedoms and rights which are guaranteed, there is a caveat to the right to life, which states that the death penalty is mandatory for anyone convicted of murder and treason. However, even though that remains the state of our constitution, in a number of cases coming out from the Privy Council, they have now determined that the right to freedom of torture means that the mandatory death penalty no longer applies, and therefore the provisions, for example, in our Offences Against the Person Act should now read may. So persons convicted of murder may be sentenced to death depending on the circumstance. So a combination of our laws, both written as well as case law, it now means that while on the books the death penalty is still there and it hangs over the head of anyone who is charged with and possibly convicted for murder and treason, it is only really applied in the worst of the worst cases. St. Kitts was the last of the Commonwealth Caribbean countries to have executed someone by hanging, having been convicted of murder. His name is Charles Laplace, and he was executed, I believe, on the 19th of December 2008. That was an offense which arose out of a domestic violence situation which turned fatal. And as a result of the manner in which it occurred, as well as the public outrage, it was an incident which occurred in the view of the public. Mr. Laplace was executed by hanging without the full due process of law being given to him, including the right to appeal to the Privy Council, as well as the right to legal representation. As it now stands, as of October 2018, we no longer have anyone currently sentenced to death. The last person was Everson Mitchum, and after a number of appeals, which included assistance from the Death Penalty Project, Mr. Mitchum's life sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. The issues that St. Kitts faces, because we are such a small population, up until 2018, 2019, we were considered the murder capital of the world based on a per capita representation, because you had over sometimes 30 to 36 murders a year in a population where the main island has about 40,000 persons. So it was very high, most of which were based on gang-related offenses. And so the idea of putting to the forefront abolishing the death penalty is obviously something which is very sensitive, because of almost every family has a story of someone they are related to who have been a victim of gang violence or someone that was murdered. So as a result of that, persons like and myself and GCL, we have a lot of difficulties in getting the death penalty abolished or automatically. So I think we have to take a more strategic approach. And I expect that when the UPR comes up for St. Kitts next week, one of the things that the government will boast about is the significant reduction in murder for the country as a result of something known as a peace treaty between the different gangs, in which the government hires members of the gang to do labor work like cleaning streets and so forth, which last year cost the country 10 million EC dollars. And this year is expected to cost the country $31 million. So while it has reduced the rate of murder, and therefore persons may be a little bit more inclined to listen to changes towards the death penalty approach to murder, we are still very far away from that. Some of the recommendations that I would make, and it really falls in line with last year's theme of access to counsel on world recognition of the abolition of the death penalty, is that although it is technically guaranteed that someone facing murder would be given legal representation, I believe that representation has to be at a very early stage. There should be more funding into legal aid so that persons facing the death penalty can have proper legal representation, more funding towards lawyers who are appointed to represent these type of individuals. I believe they can amend the legislation under the Offenses Against the Person Act to make different categories of murder, like murder 1, murder 2, so that there are different considerations and not everyone is possibly up for the death penalty. And also, I think because the prison has such a great prison reform program, we have a lot of persons who would have been initially convicted of murder and sentenced to death, whose sentence have been commuted. They have now become really, really upstanding citizens, so to speak. They have they are now contributing in society from the prison through either doing prison reform work, through having sewing clothing for prisoners, prison officers, and that sort of thing. So I think if the government places emphasis on not just reform, but also on advertising that there can be reform and rehabilitation, even if you've committed the most heinous crime, as well as ensuring the legislation has some sort of compensation package for the victims of the crime, and using part of that $31 million, not just to pay gangsters not to commit crime, so to speak, but to make sure that there's proper reform and rehabilitation, then I think we would be well on our way to getting closer towards abolishing the death penalty. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Angelina. That's really helpful perspective, and I hope we can hear a little bit more later on about some additional priority recommendations you'd like to see delegates make to the Human Rights Council. We'll stay in the region and now shift to St. Lucia. And Leila, I understand you're going to talk to us a bit about St. Lucia. So please tell us what the status is of the death penalty there, what the main issues are, and what recommendations you'd like to see coming out of the Universal Periodic Review of St. Lucia, which is scheduled for next Wednesday.
Just to remind viewers that St. Lucia and St. Kitts and Nevis are two of the 10 English-speaking Caribbean countries that have maintained the death penalty over the years. In the region, there's only one country now that maintains the mandatory death penalty, and that's us here in Trinidad and Tobago, sadly. So St. Lucia does not have the mandatory death penalty, which means that judges can take into consideration mitigating factors. And that's important, but of course it's not the end. We're striving to achieve moratorium and abolition eventually. It's important to note too that the last execution in St. Lucia took place in 1995, over 25 years ago. And although there is, and St. Lucia acknowledges that they have a de facto moratorium, they still refuse to vote for a moratorium at the UN General Assembly. So more than 25 years ago, no execution. Death sentences have not been handed down since 2011 there, and there's been no one on death row since 2013. And this is important when you think that we're holding on to the tales of colonialism and will not give up, when in fact, since 2013, nobody has been on death row. There are real issues in relation to awareness raising. We can't be talking about abolition of the death penalty without looking at whether the country is doing enough to raising awareness of the futility of the death penalty. And we know that there's a need for, these are some of the recommendations that have been made in the 2015 at the UPR in 2015 in relation to St. Lucia. St. Lucia noted, they kept noting in 2015 all the recommendations, like the need to ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, aimed at the abolition of the death penalty, but that's all they did. They noted it. They have not ratified it, the ICCPR or the second optional protocol. They have not, in relation to noting Brazil's recommendation that they should raise awareness, have awareness raising campaign on human rights, and the incompatibility between human rights and the death penalty, that was just noted and no action really has been taken on it. They have one prison in St. Lucia, and it's interesting to know, and not sad to know, that they lack access to clean drinking water. And of course, these are important issues in terms of human rights. When we incarcerate people, we must not turn into monsters. We must treat them with respect. The prison is overrun, overpopulated. I'm sorry, I was being disturbed by the phone. So it's overcrowded, and because we know that there's been World Health Organization recommendation that we look at overcrowded and unsanitary conditions in the light of COVID, then we need to look at what our countries in the region are doing to address this issue. St. Lucia's constitution doesn't provide for subsidized or free legal representation by a legal practitioner if a defendant can't afford private attorney. And that's important because, as you know, World Coalition, the last World, they focused on the need for effective legal counsel throughout the judicial proceedings. And so that's an issue that, in terms of when I come on to the recommendations, I would like to make, sorry, I don't know how else to do this. So overcrowded, unsanitary condition, need to, if we look at the recommendations now that you've listed there, as well as that, given the fact that St. Lucia's constitution doesn't provide for subsidized or free legal representation, I would recommend that funding is allocated for subsidized free or subsidized legal aid throughout the judicial proceedings, and access to effective and efficient counsel. We need to categorize murder the same throughout our region, not just to have, they've in fact in St. Lucia, the death penalty, although it's not mandatory, it's the whole range of, it can be a sentence for variant crimes: aggravated murder, murder of criminal justice personnel, murder in sex offenses, hate crimes, drug trafficking, terrorism for capital gain, part of multiple murders, and murders by an offender who has previously been convicted of murder. So there are all these different areas that you can be sentenced for murder for, but we need to categorize it, and that, in my view, would assist. Another recommendation I would like to make is all our countries have the, we have a mercy committee, yeah, and a committee on the prerogative of mercy. And if we're going to treat, the motto of most of our prisoners to hold and treat, well, we're not treating them. So like Angelina, I would like to see proper rehabilitation program, treatment and rehabilitation from the time a person enters, so the recommendation for proper treatment and rehabilitation. And then as people can change, then I would recommend that the Committee on the Prerogative of Mercy look at, legally, I think they have to look at a situation for everybody every 2 years, that they look at those who have been rehabilitated, and that there's an opportunity for people even to have their, even if they were committed to life, to have an opportunity after a certain period of time, 25, 30 years, whatever, to be rehabilitated into society. And I don't think, these recommendations are, pie in the sky. It can be done. So that's another key, as well as categorizing murder, to look at the role of the Committee on the Prerogative of Mercy and rehabilitating those who have been sentenced to death and have been, well, in fact, any of those who have been committed to life. Life, in my view, should not mean all your life. You know, we're human beings and we can change, and the role of society is not to act as those who contributed to the murders, but to show that we are humanitarian, or have humanitarian hearts, and that people could change, and we will rehabilitate them and integrate them back into society. Just to give you an example, in my commission, we run a rehab center for ex-prisoners, get them jobs, get them bank accounts. It can be done. So let's look forward to a time when we can change hearts and minds by doing the right thing, by putting in place systems that will help us as a region to move forward. We've come a long way from the days when we held on to the mandatory death penalty. To have only one country now, Trinidad and Tobago, with the mandatory death penalty is something. But they need to look at how we all voted. Last year, they all voted against the moratorium, even though, like St. Kitts, St. Lucia, 25 years or more, they have not, they've had a de facto moratorium. So they need to get with the program, and our task is to keep writing to those in authority to do the right thing. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Leela. And I think you mentioned early on the need for legal aid for people who are at risk of being sentenced to death, because it's still a possibility that courts could pronounce death sentences.
Exactly.
And without state funded legal aid, then that means that indigent defendants are most at risk. And of course, the death penalty then has a discriminatory effect, because people who don't have the financial ability to obtain qualified counsel are going to be at greatest risk. And even if down the road there are commutations of sentences or people are not executed, it's still nonetheless an important human rights issue. And it sounds as though that would be a useful recommendation to ensure free legal aid to indigent defendants that would help not only with respect to the death penalty, but in a broader sense in the criminal justice system.
And can I just say, it's not just free legal aid, because research has shown that quite often the free legal aid is not competent. Quite often it's not a competent lawyer that they get. So we want competent legal, representation.
Right, so free qualified legal, yes, indeed. And in many countries, we see recommendations to ensure that the state provides sufficient training to attorneys who are providing, whether as a part of a legal aid scheme or on a pro bono basis, or whether they're paid counsel. It's very complicated to defend in a capital case where the death penalty is a potential penalty in the case, and providing that training is quite important. So that, I think, is an important issue to raise. So now we will transition to cover Mauritania and Myanmar. And I saw for just a brief moment that our colleague from Mauritania, Fatimata Mbaye, had joined us, but it seems as though she's dropped from the call. I'm hoping she'll be able to rejoin us. I sent her a quick email. But I will let Elizabeth take over. And maybe, Elizabeth, you first want to talk about Myanmar, and then if Fatimata still hasn't joined us, then you can talk about Mauritania, and then I will wrap up with Lebanon.
Sure, thanks, Amy.
And I should introduce Elizabeth as my colleague at the Advocates for Human Rights. Elizabeth, why don't you tell folks your role here at our organization?
Sure. My name is Elizabeth. I am the Program Associate for International Justice at the Advocates for Human Rights based in Minneapolis, and I work with Amy. So I'm going to talk about Myanmar. So though Myanmar has reportedly observed a de facto moratorium on the death penalty since 1988, courts continue to render death sentences, and local media have reported several executions. And the government does not publish official statistics regarding death sentences or executions. So it's difficult to determine, how many executions are happening and how many sentences are being handed down. Additionally, the death penalty is available for more than just the most serious crimes. So it's available for crimes that result in death, regardless of whether there was an intent to kill, as well as for certain drug crimes and offenses against the state. Furthermore, the imposition of the death penalty is mandatory for certain offenses. So our first recommendation would be, while working toward the death penalty, to eliminate the mandatory death penalty and ensure that all judges are freely able to exercise discretion to impose alternative penalties. The death penalty may also be imposed disproportionately on Rohingya men or to target political opponents or the government. There are also, like in St. Kitts and in St. Lucia, there are issues of fair trial and administration of justice. So defendants do not have adequate access to counsel in general. An alarming number of detained persons do not understand the charges they face or the sentences that they have received. Defendants often meet their attorney on the first day of trial or have no legal representation whatsoever. Only defendants with capital cases have the right to an attorney provided at government expense. So our second recommendation would be to ensure that all defendants, especially those facing a death sentence, have access to their own counsel at all stages of investigation, judicial proceedings, trial, appeal, pardon, commutation, and habeas corpus proceedings, regardless of their ability to pay. There are also issues of torture and torture while in detention and poor conditions of detention. So the Army and Border Police repeatedly use torture and other forms of ill treatment. Also, persons in detention and in prisons face torture at the hands of government officials. One example is the use of dog cells, which are designed originally for guard dogs, but that officials use to restrict people's movement. Conditions of detention also do not meet international standards. So people in prisons and labor camps face overcrowding, torture and degrading treatment, inadequate access to medical care and food, water, or other basic needs. So our third recommendation would be to create an independent authority to conduct credible, impartial investigations of allegations of torture and other ill treatment. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about the treatment of human rights defenders in Myanmar. So human rights defenders, journalists, and others who publicly speak out against injustice continue to face reprisals and persecution. Government soldiers have even murdered several prominent human rights activists, and other activists have been prosecuted for participating in peaceful protests. So our final recommendation would be to cease prosecution and harassment of human rights defenders, promoting fair trial rights and opposing the death penalty, and release all persons detained for legitimately and peacefully exercising their right to freedom of expression. Okay, so that concludes my remarks on
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Myanmar.
It looks like maybe Fatimata is with us. Elizabeth, maybe you want to check in with her and see if she can hear us.
Fatima, vous êtes là? I think she is here.
Fatimata, vous nous écoutez? Je crois que vous avez coupé le micro. Est-ce que vous pouvez, comment dit-on, Elizabeth, unmute?
Je ne sais pas, c'est difficile.
Can you unmute her, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I am asking her to unmute.
Okay. Bear with us for just a moment. I think it'll be quite helpful if we can hear from Fatimata herself about Mauritania, if we can get her audio working. And as we're working out these technical issues, if you have questions for any of our panelists, you can use the Q&A function.
Hello.
Bienvenue,
Oui, bonjour,
Fatimata.
Est-ce que vous nous écoutez?
Merci, merci. Vous m'entendez là? Est-ce
Oui.
que vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Donc, merci beaucoup. Moi, je vous écoute, je vous entends, mais merci beaucoup en tout cas. Merci les questions. Mais je pense, pour ce qui est de la peine de mort à Mauritanie, bon, on a des difficultés. Sorry.
Non, je pense que la connexion n'est pas très
Nous
bonne.
avons des difficultés. Bien poser des questions pour savoir exactement. Absolument. Hello.
Ok,
Allô?
c'est mieux, je pense.
Oui, c'est mieux.
Alors, est-ce que vous
Oh my
pouvez...
God, c'est pas mieux, c'est parce que moi, je ne vous entends pas. Yeah?
Ok. Alors,
Allô?
est-ce que vous,
Oui,
est-ce que vous pouvez parler de l'état de la peine de mort en Mauritanie et puis
Absolument,
Ok.
absolument.
et vos recommandations de priorité aussi?
D'accord. Bon, donc, commencer les recommandations pour nous prioritaires, c'est que la Mauritanie abandonne la peine de mort, donc il y a une abolition définitive. On a
Oh,
Seems like maybe we've
okay,
temporarily lost Fatima. So hopefully she'll be able to reconnect. Why don't I go on and start talking about Lebanon, and then if Fatima rejoins us, we can give her back the floor, and hopefully we'll be able to get the connection a bit better. So Lebanon, so it was discouraging to hear, oh, here she looks like maybe she's back. Fatima, vous avez revenu?
désolé,
Pas de problème.
c'est des... Yes, oui, je suis revenue, I'm back. Donc, je disais donc le moratoire interne universel. Si ça va marcher, mais ça va être un peu difficile pour moi. Hello, vous m'entendez?
oui.
Vous m'entendez? Can you hear me?
Oui,
Oui.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Oui, nous attendons.
Vous m'entendez?
oui.
Voilà, donc je disais que pour pousser la Mauritanie à ratifier, en fait, à accepter le moratoire universel, parce qu'aujourd'hui, devant les juridictions mauritaniennes, on a toujours les condamnations à mort. Et nous avons des personnes parfois qui sont des malades mentaux qui sont condamnées à mort. Nous avons parfois des étrangers qui sont condamnés à mort, qui sont très loin de leur famille. Et les condamnés à mort sont souvent envoyés à l'intérieur du pays, vers la prison de Birmogren ou la prison d'Aleg. Birmogren et la prison d'Aleg est à peu près à 500, 600, 550 km de Nouakchott. Et nous pensons que la Mauritanie a déjà un avantage, c'est celui d'avoir adopté un moratoire de fait depuis 1987. Il n'y a pas d'exécution, mais il y a toujours cette peur qui pèse sur les condamnés à mort qui sont dans les couloirs de la mort. Et nous pensons que la Mauritanie doit tout simplement abolir la peine de mort de tous les textes pénaux qui existent au niveau. À adopter les mécanismes, c'est aussi une forme de torture. Même si effectivement je comprends parfaitement bien que la Mauritanie nous comprenons aussi, nous sommes musulmans, que la Mauritanie est un pays musulman et que l'islam a une place près de la législation des institutions de la charia qui sont en code pénal mauritanien. Il n'empêche que le code pénal mauritanien doit être révisé et mis en harmonie avec les textes internationaux. Parce que nous pensons aussi qu'au niveau mauritanien, aujourd'hui, nous avons ce que nous appelons la DIA, qui est le prix du sang. Nous avons la DIA renforcée, qui est aussi un prix du sang. Et à partir du moment où les tribunaux
Looks like maybe we lost Fatima again. So apologies for these technical difficulties. Sometimes it's, sometimes the internet connections are not as good as we would hope. And it's really unfortunate because I think it's really important to hear from abolitionists on the ground in the countries that are being reviewed, rather than us speaking for them, but sometimes technology just doesn't allow for that to happen. I'll continue with the presentation of Lebanon, and we'll keep an eye out to see if Fatima can rejoin us. So I was going to draw a contrast to what we heard about St. Kitts and Nevis and St. Lucia with respect to the UN General Assembly moratorium resolution. Every 2 years, there's a resolution put forth in the General Assembly calling for a worldwide abolition or worldwide moratorium on executions. And Lebanon, for the first time last month, voted in favor of the resolution. And we in the abolitionist community are really hopeful that that is a sign of good things to come, especially for the upcoming UPR, that Lebanon perhaps is moving in the right direction. Lebanon has not had any executions since 2004, but courts in Lebanon continue to sentence people to death. And we're hoping that this might be a signal last month that Lebanon in 2021 is ready to take further steps toward abolition. We were concerned as we were looking back over this third period for the Universal Periodic Review that the Interior Minister called for application of the death penalty in 2017. That hasn't happened. So those calls were not heeded, which we think is a good thing. And we think it would be good to give Lebanon some praise for progress it has made over the last 5 years. Lebanon, torture is a really important issue, especially in capital cases. And Lebanon accepted several recommendations in 2015 to adopt and implement a national anti-torture mechanism. Lebanon has criminalized torture in the last 5 years, established investigation procedures, and has, at least by law, prohibited the use of confessions that are extracted via torture. These are really important first steps, and we hope that delegates will praise Lebanon for those steps, but there's really need for further action. Despite the legal changes in practice, there are reports that torture is routine during police investigations, and reports say that military courts frequently use torture to coerce confessions despite the 2017 anti-torture law. And of course, this results in violations of fair trial rights in addition to violations of the prohibition against torture, but it's of particular concern in capital cases, which are by and large, a lot of the death penalty cases relate to terrorism. And so there's a high likelihood that that we don't have confidence in the outcomes of those proceedings because of the use of torture as well. Similar to what Leila was talking about with respect to St. Lucia, there is no state funding for a legal aid scheme in Lebanon. So another recommendation that would be helpful would be to ensure the quality of legal aid for indigent clients, because even if attorneys do take on these cases, they're often untrained and unprepared to take on those cases. Another important issue in Lebanon is the practice of sentencing people to death in absentia. That is to say, when people are not present at trial. Et moi, je vois que Fatima vient de rejoindre notre conversation. Fatima, est-ce que vous nous écoutez? I see she's still connecting. So I'll finish my point about in absentia death sentences. So in 2019 alone, there were 14 people who were sentenced to death in absentia in Lebanese courts. 13 of those individuals were foreign nationals. So it's highly problematic to have these in absentia death sentences. Fatima, vous nous écoutez? Êtes-vous là, Fatima?
Oui, je
On
suis
ne
de
vous a-
retour
Ok.
encore. J'ai
Ah,
des problèmes de connexion.
ah.
J'ai
Oui,
des problèmes de
comme-
connexion.
Comme d'habitude.
My connection is not working. My internet is not working. I have some
Il me semble que la connexion est mieux maintenant. Est-ce
so
que
I can follow. I can follow.
oui, s'il vous plaît.
Do I I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Pas de problème, nous
sorry.
comprenons. Si vous voulez continuer
Oui,
la
je
présentation,
peux
s'il vous plaît.
Oui, je peux continuer. Je continue donc. Je vais continuer.
Oui,
s'il
s'il vous plaît.
Oui, donc je disais que les tribunaux continuent encore à condamner à mort. En Mauritanie, seuls les enfants sont exemptés de la peine de mort. Pour les enfants qui ont commis des crimes, c'est-à-dire des mineurs en conformité avec la loi qui ont commis des crimes, ils ne sont pas passibles de la peine de mort. Ils sont condamnés entre 10 ans et 12 ans de prison. Parce que dans l'ancien code pénal mauritanien, il est prévu, on parle de l'enfant de 16 ans qui est condamné à la moitié de la peine, donc condamné à la perpétuité. Et pour nous, aujourd'hui, la perpétuité et la peine de mort, c'est équivalent, puisque la personne, il n'y a pas la remise de peine qui lui permet de ressortir de la prison et donc d'être réinséré à nouveau dans la vie sociale. Et nous pensons que ceux qui sont condamnés à mort et qui sont encore dans les couloirs de la mort rencontrent énormément de difficultés parce que parfois, il y a ceux qui meurent en prison sans qu'on sache exactement pourquoi ils sont morts en prison. Et les familles n'ont pas les moyens effectivement de mener des enquêtes, savoir pourquoi ils sont morts. Ils ne sont pas exécutés parce qu'il n'y a plus d'exécution de la peine de mort en Mauritanie, mais il y a la condamnation qui existe dans les tribunaux et qui existe encore dans les textes. Et donc, nous, notre recommandation, c'est que la Mauritanie harmonise son texte interne, c'est-à dire le code pénal mauritanien, au standard interne susceptible d'être condamné. Deuxième chose, mobilité. Effectivement, il y a des alternatives, parce qu'il y a des alternatives à l'emprisonnement qui peuvent être utilisées. Et les familles, et si bien les familles que les
Apologies again for the technical difficulties. I feel like maybe piece by piece we'll get more of what Fatimata has to say. So hoping she will rejoin us again. I will continue, apologize for the ping pong here, but I'll go back to talking about Lebanon as we wait. I'd been talking about people being sentenced to death in absentia in Lebanon. This is a really concerning practice, of course, violating the fair trial rights of a defendant. And so we would suggest a recommendation to end the practice of sentencing people to death in absentia, and for foreign nationals ensure that the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations is respected, and that all foreign nationals who are at risk of being sentenced to death are afforded the right to consular notification. Then another issue I wanted to talk about is the use of military courts. In Lebanon, military courts have broad jurisdiction over civilians, and the judges in military courts are not required to have legal training. They're part of the military hierarchy, so they're not independent adjudicators. And so it's highly concerning that there are so many civilians being tried in those military courts. And there are a lot of reports of violations of fair trial guarantees in the military court system. But also problematic is that there's restricted access to military courts. So civil society organizations don't have open access to those courts, nor do journalists. And so it's much more difficult to monitor the proceedings in military courts as well. So we would suggest a recommendation to end jurisdiction of military courts over civilians, and at a minimum to end that jurisdiction in capital cases or where the death penalty is a possible sentence. I see Fatima is still connecting, so I'll move on to the last point that I wanted to raise with respect to Lebanon, and that has to do with prison conditions. There are people on death row in Lebanon, and in Lebanese prisons, there's extreme overcrowding. And so we would suggest a recommendation to bring prison conditions in line with the Nelson Mandela rules, especially with respect to prison crowding and other physical conditions of the prison environment, which are quite troubling in Lebanon. So that's I got through the end of Lebanon. And while we're waiting for Fatimata, we also have time to take questions. So you can use the Q&A function to pose your questions. And it looks like maybe Fatima is back with us. Fatima, est-ce que vous nous écoutez? Fatima, are you there? Vous êtes avec nous? Fatima? I'm not quite sure what the trouble is now. It seems as though she's connected, but we're not hearing her speak. So, Fatima, si vous nous écoutez, est-ce que vous pouvez dire quelque chose? Nous n'écoutons rien. Well, perhaps we can encourage Fatima to provide sort of a written summary of what her comments would be. And Elizabeth and Carter, if you received email outreach about our event, Elizabeth and Carter were the ones reaching out to you, and we can send those out in writing, perhaps as an alternative if we can't hear from Fatima, which is really too bad. But you also should have received our one-pager that the Mauritanian Coalition for Human Rights, or the Mauritanian Association for Human Rights, was involved with creating, along with ECPM, Ensemble contre la peine de mort. So apologies for that. But we do have about 10 minutes before we wrap up, and I thought it would be helpful to hear from our panelists about what your hopes are for the UPRs that are coming up next week and the following week. So St. Kitts and Nevis will be reviewed on Tuesday, St. Lucia on Wednesday. Angelina and Leela, what are you like? What are you most optimistic about for the interactive dialogue to the extent it covers the death penalty?
Yeah, Angelina, you want to go first? Since you went first.
Okay, thanks, Leila. I don't expect, I know the recommendations are going to be the usual: abolish the death penalty, ratify ICCPR and the second optional protocol. I'm not too optimistic that those recommendations, 2 specific recommendations, would be accepted, but I'm hoping that out of the work that GCM has been doing in St. Kitts, particularly as it relates to the lack of proper access to counsel and competent counsel, that perhaps there could be some recommendations, or even the government of St. Kitts giving an undertaking to provide those resources. Because, for example, getting proper, we don't have a pathologist in St. Kitts, so normally you have to get or ballistics experts. I think there may be a pathologist now, but when you have the state and the defense on 2 opposite sides, with the state wanting, for example, the death penalty, and I should add that last year, Brandon Lee, the DPP, did make an application for the death penalty to be imposed against him. He was a 21-year-old gentleman who was convicted of murdering his sister and burying her body in the mountains. So it was something that really outraged the public. And so I think that was perhaps what motivated the DPP to apply for the death penalty. After his counsel, who Mr. Chesley Hamilton, made their submissions, the DPP at the end of the sentencing hearing sort of conceded that this particular crime was not the worst of the worst. But it came down to a counsel who, notwithstanding the lack of proper legal resources, not having his legal bills paid by the government after representing persons on death row, because of his goodwill in pursuing the case, Ms. Brandon Lee was able to get a life sentence as opposed to a death sentence. And as a result of that, Brandon Lee wrote CXC, which is a regional exam, last year, June, I think it was, and he placed very high in math in the region, which shows that with the right resources, individuals like Brandon Lee can be saved. I'm hoping that the government would accept, whether it is to do like Trinidad and have a public defense department set up, or some sort of fund, and perhaps the funding should no longer be from the same government that wants to execute the defendant. Perhaps if they can assist in the setting up of a non-governmental organization, which will then fund money towards public defense. I would like to see something like that. There have been so many talks about a new prison. Our prison is very old, it's 1840s, in the middle of our capital. There's no room for expansion. It is overcrowded. When you have 36 murders a year, 90% of those being gang related, more often than not, for each murder, you have at least 2, 3, or 4 persons charged with each murder. If that person is, if of course investigation leads to a charge. So the prison capacity is definitely overcrowded, and we have started many years ago. There was funding for building a new prison. The plans have been approved. The lot has been identified. So I'm hoping to hear that work will begin very shortly on establishing a new prison that will be in tune in terms of square footage with human rights, international requirements, and the Nelson Mandela rules. But I don't want all of the funding to be on just having a better place to imprison persons. I would like to see more monies in the budget going towards prevention of crime, towards conflict resolution training, particularly in the high schools, some sort of, when persons report, because domestic violence is, as I said, is another area where, which accounts for murders in St. Kitts. I would like to see, when victims report domestic violence, that there are proper training towards the police officers, that they really take this seriously, and have legislation put in place where even if the victim decides that he or she is not going to pursue it anymore, that there's some conflict resolution training occurring. I would also like to see an analysis being done on where exactly, what type of murders occur, whether it is armed robbery, gang-related, domestic violence, so you have an idea of where to kind of zero in to prevent persons from committing crimes and therefore possibly facing the death penalty. and more resources on things like experts that can assist defense counsels, such as their own access to ballistics experts outside of what DPP will have, pathologists, and any other type of expert that may become necessary. Just to show the importance of it, Charles Laplace, I looked at his file, there were 3 different psychiatric reports during the sentencing stage. One which would have supported him being fit to be sentenced, and 2 would have come back showing signs of temporary insanity or mental conditions. And I think if Mr. Laplace had gotten proper access to counsel from the time he was arrested all the way through, perhaps Mr. Laplace would be here with us today. So I in addition to the usual recommendations that are being made, I would also like to see the Mercy Committee being properly set up and running. For the past 2 years, myself along with the Death Penalty Project have been writing to get persons reviewed by the committee to find out what is the procedure for review, and we've not had any substantive response to that. So I would like to see the Mercy Committee set up properly. We also have in our rules room for a 4-year review, which would then allow recommendations to be made to the Governor General to commute any person on life sentence or death sentence. I would like to see that put in place and information about this being made accessible, not just to the prisoners, to the public, so that we can move on from there. And lastly, perhaps the government needs to invest money in really uncovering whether or not this idea of the death penalty is a deterrent, or whether public opinion still holds towards the death penalty, whether that still exists. Because based on the work that we've done, we see that more persons are moving away from the idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And even after, for example, when Mr. Laplace was executed, the amount of murders rose the next year. So perhaps if resources are spent towards investigating where exactly all the factors that are usually held for why the death penalty should happen, if research could be done to see whether those are still, what holds true, then perhaps I think that could help shift the politicians, because politicians will take the view which they think will get them reelected. And in some cases, we spend a lot of time and money on polls on who's the most popular politician, who's the most popular, and that sort of thing. If some of those resources can go towards questions such as this, do you think the death penalty should be retained? Do you think it's a deterrent? And that sort of thing. I think it will help us go into the direction of either, if not the abolition of the death penalty, to a de jure moratorium, because we have a de facto moratorium right now.
Okay.
Thank you. Fatima, est-ce que vous nous écoutez? Vous pouvez dire quelque chose? Sounds like she's still not with us. So thank you, Angelina. And Leila, what are your hopes for the interactive dialogue for St. Lucia next Wednesday?
Okay, well, a number of things. We noted that in 2019, the National Security Minister said that any constitutional reform it's the society at large that should determine whether the country abolish the death penalty, which means that you can't just do it, you have to raise awareness first of all. Before there's any referendum or anything, you can't go in cold. There needs to be, so I would hope that there'll be nationwide discussion about the issues at all levels in our schools, in our faith communities, etc., about the issue, about the futility of the death penalty. So that's one thing, awareness raising, education, and using the media for that. The media could be a good friend in that. The other, one of the cases from the Privy Council, I think Aaron Trimmingham, made it clear that if a country is going to consider, in our region, Commonwealth country, when you consider the death penalty, they must obtain clinical psychologist report. And as Angelina was saying, many of our countries either don't have clinical psychologists or access or funding to pay them, particularly when we note that, for instance, in St. Lucia, you don't have, you have to pay for your own, counsel. So the other thing I want to see is that a fund is established to pay for competent counsel. And quite often, like in Trinidad, many of the counsel from that's allocated to people are not trained and not well trained. So trained, competent counsel I would like to see, and forensic in the UPR report, it's clear that we have inadequate in St. Lucia, inadequate protection for witnesses. So witness protection is a problem in all our small, on all our small islands. Witness protection because of the size of our islands. And I know that some of the ministers of national security have been talking about witness protection with, with corresponding islands, send your witnesses to another island so that you wait. So there's strategies one can use, even though we're small islands. There's limited forensic capabilities, and we need to beef up forensic capabilities, and the delay in accessing information and processing evidence. These are things that really can be done. They're low, in my view, low-hanging fruit. So the whole issue about overcrowding in the prison, it's one prison, and I understand in 2019, since 2019, it's been overcrowded. We can look at issues of overcrowding and make sure that detention conditions are going to be in keeping with the World Health Organization recommendation in relation to COVID-19 and what should be done in these times. In all our islands, somehow the Mercy Committee doesn't operate as it should operate. Yes, we want victims to have a say, but we must, the Privy Council has already made it clear that quite often when the Mercy Committee is going to meet, there's been case law that says that the person who is in prison should have an opportunity to either present information himself or herself or via an attorney to the Mercy Committee, so that the Mercy Committee doesn't sit cold on this, but have some information to go on. The Mercy Committee in our region and in St. Lucia could do a lot more to take us forward, while we still have the other recommendations about abolition, a moratorium, etc. So I'm hoping that Mercy Committees can, and they need to be trained, they need to receive training. You don't just get appointed to a Mercy Committee without looking at what your roles and responsibilities are. So those are some of the things I'd like to see, but the main thing, particularly since the minister said, let the country decide, the country can only decide on abolishing the death penalty if they are aware of what the issues are. And you would be aware perhaps of the reports by the late Professor Roger Hood, who died last month, I think it was, and Florence Simangal, who's done some amazing work, research from the University of the West Indies about people's perception. If you ask the right questions, like if they're going to be a discussion in society in St. Lucia about whether they should abolish the death penalty, the kind of questions that are asked are important. And the reports of Roger Hood and Simangal should inform any plans to go out and consult before any referendum on abolishing the death penalty. Because if you ask the question one way, you get, yes, hang them high. But if you ask in the way in which Roger and Florence have been asking, then you get a totally different view. So preparing for any referendum, to me, would be important. And this is where GCL and other organizations can come in handy, the Death Penalty Project, World Coalition, to inform any questions that's going to go out in a referendum. So those are some of the key things, as well as the other ordinary recommendations about moratorium and abolition, etc.
Great, thank you, Leela. And I think both of your comments underscore the equity of arms issue here, that when the state has the entire state apparatus to bring to bear in a prosecution, even if there's good, well-qualified defense counsel appointed, there are financial resources that are needed to conduct an investigation, to obtain expert reports, and especially in small island nations where you may have just one expert at hand, if the state hires that expert, then you have to go to another country to find someone. And so it's really important to ensure that there's an equal playing field for defendants in those cases. Fatima, I see you even now. I see you nodding. Je vous vois, Fatima. Est-ce que vous nous écoutez? Nous allons au fin de la présentation, mais si vous avez quelque chose à dire au fin, je vous donne la parole. Maybe not. Well,
Okay.
apologies for these technical difficulties. It's nice to at least see Fatima. And we'll follow up by email with those of you delegates to the council. Perhaps we can get Fatima to provide us a written summary of what she would have been saying. So we're optimistic about the upcoming interactive dialogues, and we'll be monitoring those. And we will also be planning to do some Facebook Live debriefing sessions, as we did with the last session of the UPR working group. So after the interactive dialogues happen, we'll come back and have a discussion about what happened, what we're optimistic about, and what we hope to see going forward with the states accepting certain recommendations and the like. So look for us next week and the following week for those debriefing sessions as well. And I hope Angelina and Leela will be able to join us for those, as they did with Jamaica last time in November. So with that, thank you all for joining us. And again, apologies for the technical difficulties. We appreciate the opportunity to speak about these issues, and we hope to see a lot of recommendations during the interactive dialogues about these death penalty issues. So thank you again for joining us, and we will be all watching eagerly on UN Web TV for those interactive dialogues next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.